In a previous video, we looked at a Python program that simulated rolling two dice until snake eyes, 2 ones, occurred, and then we calculated the average number of times over a number of samples. We're going to push that example further by this time adding functions and then setting ourselves up in the end to do statistics beyond just the average. We're going to consider 3 variations on our snake eyes simulation program. The URLs can be seen here. The first is going to take the while loop of the simulation. So we were rolling 2 dice, and while it was not a snake eyes, we stayed in the loop and continued to count the number of rolls. That is going to be separated out into a function that can then be called. In version 2, we are going to take the averaging over the samples. In that case, that's the for loop, and we're going to move that into a function. That will be a main function, and then at the very end of our program, main will be called, and everything else will be executed after that main function is called at the end of the program. And then in our third version, we are going to start saving the results of each while loop, of each call of the function that we made for the first version we're considering in this case. And we are going to put those results into a list to remember them so that we can do statistics beyond the average, for instance, like a median. So we are taking the setup for the while loop and the while loop from our simulation, and we are using that to define a function. So we start off with line 10 with the keyword def, and then we create a name for our function, count to snake eyes in this case, and then open close parenthesis. This function has no arguments. It has no information that we must send it in order for it to do its job. 11, 12, 13 are the setups before the while loop, the resetting the counter, the establishing the die, the 2 dice so long as they're not both ones, so that we get into our while loop. And then in 15, the while loop, the continuing to roll the dice so long as the sum is not 2. 16 and 17, the rolling of the dice. 19, the incrementing of the counter. And then 20 is a new line belonging to the function, and that is that when we have finished the while loop, notice the outdenting compared to the while loop, so we are returning the roll count. So we are sending back, somebody calls this function, and then we send back to that function this number of times we had to roll in order to achieve snake eyes. So after we define a function that gives us a count of the number of rolls in order to achieve a snake eyes, then we can call that function. In this case, we're going to call that function over and over again. So we are in a for loop, so we're going over the number of samples. In 25, we are calling our function count to snake eyes. Again, there were no arguments. I don't need any information sent to this function in order for it to do its job. That function returned the count of the number of rolls to achieve snake eyes, and that returned value gets assigned to our variable in 25 called snake. In line 26, that snake number is being printed out, and in 27 it is being added to our sum. And then in 28, outside of the for loop, because of the outdenting, then we are ready to calculate the average, which is the sum over the number of samples. A function must be defined before it can be called, and this gave our first version of the program with functions sort of a bottom-up organization. We defined that innermost while loop, defining it as a function. We had to define that function first, and then we could call that function in a for loop. In this version 2 of the program, we are going to define a second function we're calling main, and we're going to move the for loop into that main function. This is going to allow us to have a more top-down organization, to say that this function we are defining first, it calls the other function, which we are going to define below that, but we won't call this main function until the very bottom of the program. So everything will be defined before it's called, but we can sort of then rearrange some of the logic within our program and think about it differently. So this will give us a top-down sort of organization. So this main function, sort of the first thing we see if we're looking through the code is that we are averaging over the samples. We see that logic first, and then we see that, oh, what are we averaging over? This count to snake eyes function, and then that will be defined lower. So it allows us to have a top-down vision of the program. So as promised, then the main function gets called at the bottom of the program. So here we are in line 34, 35, the bottom of the program, and in 35 we are calling that function main that we defined above. The if above it has to do with how the program is being invoked. So this is sort of a protection of, is this the program that is being run, or is this program trying to be run by some other program? That's what this if is about. We'll worry about that more later. And all this rearranging in functions seems to be, unnecessary, but it is an organizational scheme that we will see when we get to Flask. So in this third version of the program, we are going to collect all of the samples. So we were rolling the dice until we got snake eyes and doing a count. And previously we had just been summing up those counts and performing an average. But now we're going to start saving each individual count into a list so that we can do other statistics such as the median. So in line 10, we're defining this list to hold all these numbers, and at this stage it is just an empty list, so snake eyes equals open close square bracket. And then in 16 we are calling count to snake eyes function, and then when that function returns a value, we are appending it to our snake eyes list, and then at the end we are printing out this snake eyes list. So we're outside of the for loop. So when we're done collecting all of our samples, we are printing the list. So you would see this big long list of numbers at the end. And so here we see our results collected in the list. So we see the square bracket at the beginning and the end, indicating that it's a list, the numbers separated by commas, and now we're set up that we could do all kinds of statistics on this set of numbers. We could do max and min and median and average and standard deviation and first and third quartiles and all sorts of things.